Well, it's great to have everyone here. How many of you are members of Village Preservation? I'm glad to see so many hands. Thank you so much. Your membership is greatly appreciated. For the rest of you, shame. I'm very disappointed. But I'll tell you why you should become a member. Village Preservation was founded in 1980, and we work to preserve the architectural, cultural, and historic heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoVo. We've helped get over 1,300 buildings designated, over 100 blocks as well. And we host about 75 to 80 free programs like this throughout the year. So I'm a very busy man putting together all our programs. But we couldn't do any of this work without your support. So that's why we always like to thank our members for all the extraordinary help that they do in helping us do our advocacy work, programming work, but also, I highly recommend please go to villagepreservation.org and check out all the extraordinary resources that we have available, whether you decide to become a member or not. Our most recent virtual map that we introduced is the history of Fifth Avenue. It was just its 200th birthday at the end of 2024. Go online, take a look, check it out. We have tons of other great maps that help you learn about all the great buildings and the extraordinary people that have lived in our neighborhoods. Now I want to thank our co-host, First Presbyterian Church. It's a great honor to work with them on this. And also Merchants House Museum as well. They are also co-sponsoring this event. Please go to merchantshouse.org, learn about all the extraordinary work that they do in preserving the 1832 Merchants House. Right now, they are in a bit of a pickle, so they definitely need your help. Learn about the issues that they're having because there's going to be some construction starting right next to that building, and they're very worried about the plaster, 1830s plaster being shaken off the walls. So they do have a petition. Please sign that petition if you haven't already. But also just go visit the house. It's really, really beautiful. They also have lots of great little exhibitions there as well. But I will be quiet now, and I'm going to hand it over to the esteemed panel who will introduce themselves. Thank you so much.
I'm going to come up here for our opening remarks. I'm Suzanne Metz. I'm not at work, so I won't tell you why I'm at work. I am a member of First Presbyterian Church and the chair of our Facing Racism Action Group. I have been here for a long time and came to this congregation with a love of history, so was drawn to the history of this church, and that's part of how I became involved with this project. I'm going to introduce our other panelists tonight, which sort of from my left to the right, from right to left. First, we have David Foltz, who is currently an adjunct professor of American history at the City College of New York and a PhD candidate in American history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. David has been a member of First Presbyterian Church since 1986. He currently serves as a volunteer and as our volunteer church archivist. During the research and writing of this project, David served in an advisory capacity and was instrumental in us being able to do this report. Next, we have Susan Jackson, who joined First Presbyterian Church in 2000. She serves as an elder working on social justice issues. Her main focus as a volunteer researcher in the Facing Racism Action Project was slaveholding in the church's Greenwich Village neighborhood. Susan is the editorial director at Juilliard and holds a bachelor's degree in American history and a master's in history of education. Finally, Sorrel Ann Alberger is an elder and member of First Presbyterian Church since 2001. She holds a master's degree with a specialization in social justice and development from the University of Pennsylvania. As a volunteer researcher on denominational and pastoral connections to slavery, Sorrel served as a collaborative co-author of the Old First and Slavery Report. She currently works in the nonprofit consulting. So, our structure for the evening is that each of us who are members of the panel will speak for 5 to 7 minutes about an area that we focused on within the report or in the process, and then I will come back for just a few minutes with some closing remarks before we move into an open Q&A era for you to ask us questions or willing to ask questions of the panelists before we invite you to share your questions or thoughts with us. We'll have some slides, so and please do let us know if you have difficulty hearing us, if you need to step back to this microphone or just adjust the way we're speaking. So I do want to provide some background on First Presbyterian Church, as we are now called, was founded in 1716, and we were known at that time as Old First, or the Presbyterian Church on Wall Street. We can see that the church was located on Wall Street and had a fairly small building, but that pure area of the city was grounded on the inland end by Trinity Church, and beyond Trinity Church there was our own church, City Hall, a sugar refinery, and on the water end of that street was the New York slave market. This was a fact that many of us didn't know when we started this research. And as we were doing the research, we became very much looking at other people's research around these issues, one of which was the St. Mark's Church, which had a very moving plaque on their fence acknowledging those who had been enslaved by members of their congregation or owned by Peter Stuyvesant, who was a founder there. All of this was unfolding in late 2020 and early 2021, where, of course, there was a groundswell of raising up of different materials and research that had been going on for 20, 30 years in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even into our current age, but many of us, myself included, were not as aware of the depth of research that was available about slaveholding in New York State and New York City. So we felt that it was important, not as a matter of blame, but as a matter of understanding our history and where we were and where we could be going, to be able to know who our ancestors were. So we began this research with a goal of understanding what our church might have been saying, what they might have been doing, and whether there was significant monetary supporters from the church who were enslavers or profiting from business that involved the slave trade. We were not able to delve as deeply as we might have hoped into the financials because they're pretty, the materials we had did not have very detailed financial records, And we also were able to establish that our church's endowments, which form the bulk of the ability to buy this land and do other things, were actually founded in the early 20th century. So we focused our report on the period from founding until about 1865. We looked at our trustee minutes, which is basically the board of directors, our session minutes, our elders, our deacon minutes, Hugh records, and many other resources outside of our own resources. We ended up focusing our discussions around whether we had looking to find whether we had utilized enslaved labor in the building or of our various edifices, if slavery was part of slaves or formerly enslaved individuals were part of our worship community, were enslaved, and what we as a congregation were saying and doing. That was really focused work around the pastors and their servants. So that research took us from early 2021 until about September, and then we really focused in from September to December on writing the report. We realized in the process of writing we did need to engage a bit more about the broad history and context of slavery in New York. And David, I think, will speak a little bit more about that. And we released our report to the congregation in January of 2022. We followed that release with some broad congregational conversations and have since been weaving in our reactions to the findings of the report, to our various social justice action groups, and our Facing Racism Action Group, and specifically the work that we're doing. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleagues to tell you a little bit more about the findings of the report.
Thank you, Suzanne. As she mentioned, as Suzanne mentioned, I'm volunteer archivist here at First Presbyterian. I have been since the year 2000. I was appointed, and it's just been sort of a labor of love for me. I love history, and I wanted to preserve. I thought our 300-year-plus history should really, all the documents and things that we have, all the objects should be preserved. There should be an effort to do that, and that's an ongoing thing. That personally led me to a deeper interest in history, even New York City history, which is sort of led me actually to further my studies, actually kind of a second career as a history professor. And interestingly, my focus of my PhD studies has been slavery and abolition in New York City. So this project very nicely dovetailed my two interests, the First Church history and the interest in the history of slavery and abolition in New York City. Just wanted to mention my role in this, as she mentioned, was, as Suzanne mentioned, was more advisory. I did some of the research, not very much. I did none of the writing, but what I did was I provided an overall outline structure for the report, just from my knowledge of the research papers. And you can see if you've looked at the contents, we've got an introduction, a brief history of slavery in New York City, and then it goes into more of the detail of the pastors and the membership that owned slavery, and some of them were involved with the slave trade itself. I also provided documents. We have digitized all of our records. She mentioned we have what's called a session as sort of the board of directors here. And we also have the board of trustees and some other kinds of records in terms of like membership. We've got birth records, death records, marriages, those kinds of things, stretching from 1716 when the church was founded all the way up to today. So you can imagine that's a lot. And we had this project not too many years ago where we decided we wanted to digitize everything, and we did. And it was it really was a real boon for this research project because we could share all of these documents just by emailing them to each other. And so that's what happened. And as the archivist, I had access to all of these digitized documents, and I was able to send them to the different researchers, people on the committee who were researching, and that was a great help. I also reviewed subsequent drafts. I did some fact checking of the overall composition of what was being written, made suggestions. I also suggested outside archival resources, things like census records, and there's also a real big help to us was the New York Slavery Records Index. As it was called at that time, now it's sort of morphed into the Northeast Slavery Records Index. It's sort of broadened. And it's an index that really has a database that they've compiled of not slave owners, but also names of slaves. If they can find them, connect them up to whoever owned them, dates of birth and death, and all kinds of great information. And so that was a help to us. We wanted to find out, again, sort of who were slave owners in the congregation at the time. We're talking about the 18th century into the early 19th century. Slavery was abolished in New York State finally in 1827. But in any case, that was my role in this committee, creating this report. I also provided suggestions for secondary histories, what we call, works by historians about New York City, about slavery in New York City, which I had, knowledge of because of my studies. So I was able to supply that. So that was my role, and I think I'm going to pass this on now to Susan.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? No.
Oh, wow.
I'll try again. Good evening. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah. Better.
Great. So first off, I just want to thank Village Preservation for sponsoring this discussion and the leadership of First Presbyterian for hosting tonight and for all the support we get on this project. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Suzanne for her vision in spearheading this project and definitely guiding it, David for providing guidance and context at every turn, and Sorrel for her unflagging enthusiasm and creativity and bringing it to fruition. And these three really provided a lot of the leadership for the project and the report. And by the way, the report you can find, you're so inspired after we speak. These flyers are up here. The report, the full report is on our website, and there's also a QR code to find it. Anyway, so they provided a lot of guidance. There were other members of the congregation who worked on this project, and we all worked on the nitty-gritty of the research, and that's part of what I'm going to speak about now. So when we started meeting and developing the questions we wanted to pursue,
The research process ended up being sorted into three main areas: finding information, organizing the information, and illustrating our findings. So in terms of finding information, as David has mentioned, the church has kept over the last 300 plus years these letter-bound ledgers of notes on church business. And they're amazing, and we're so grateful for all the work that went into creating them centuries ago and then digitizing them, because without that, this project wouldn't have been possible, especially during the pandemic. For those who aren't familiar with it, the Presbyterian Church was founded as part of the Protestant Reformation, and it places a very high premium on governance, which is to say the elected members determine a great deal about how things are run, and in fact some aspects of the US government are based on Presbyterian government structures. All of which to say there are always many, many committees in Presbyterian churches. This one, not least. And so my own portion of this research was to review trustee meeting minutes starting from December 31, 1803, continuing through several volumes about these more or less monthly meetings. And my portion ran through the 1820s with other members of the group looking at other committee minutes and time periods. So many details of these meetings might seem familiar to contemporary church leaders. Not enough pledges coming in, needing to raise more money to fix a leaky roof, personnel issues. There's nothing new under the sun. But the ledgers also contain these various lists of committee members and other people, and those became, as mentioned, our main window into church connections with slavery. So as we check them against the databases David mentioned. So, for instance, I came across a list of 20 people in one of the ledgers I was looking at who made donation pledges for 1804, and of those 20, at least 3 were women, which was interesting, and 8 of them seemed likely to have had 1 or more slaves according to the 1790, 1800, 1810, or 1820 censuses, which are the breakdowns in this, the New York Slavery Index. So in the organizing of information, once we began compiling all these bits and pieces that we were putting together, we created a spreadsheet and added in our list of members plus any applicable information we could find. So in some cases, the enslaved people's names were mentioned, if somebody was on a certain committee, whatever we had, and just figured we would figure out what to do with all the information once we had more of it. And just to say, there are lots of caveats in determining who was a slaveholder. Records can be incomplete. There can be various people with the same name. We were guessing that church members' main landholding, which shows up in the census, was close to the church. But a shockingly large percentage of New Yorkers owned slaves in these years, and this was a very wealthy group, so we think our numbers are in the right ballpark. Which brings us to illustrating our findings. And this chart that you can see now shows, which Sora created, it's pretty interesting, impressive, depressing. Shows the percentage of members who appear to have been slaveholders and how those numbers changed over time. Elders, which is another subgroup of church leaders. As we were scouring these records for mentions of slavery, one of the questions we were trying to determine, as Suzanne mentioned, was the extent to which money coming into the church derived from slavery and whether slave labor might have had connections with church land. And that led me to, because the records I was working on stretched from 1801 to the early 1820s, that, as it happens, was a time when New York City was expanding northward into a separate area known as Greenwich Village. And Old First decided to move north as well. So our current church, which is right behind us and attached to this building, was built in the mid-1840s, starting in 1844, finished in 1846. So as part of this project, I did a deep dive into the land we're now on, and thank you again for all your great records, village preservation. And looking into the previous ownership of the parcels on which it was built, I'm sorry to report that some of these parcels were owned by people who also owned enslaved persons at one point or another, because doing this research has been fascinating and sobering and, you know, leaving us open to many more conversations, which I hope we will continue even tonight. But with that, I will hand the mic to Sorrel.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Before we start, I just wanted to give a shout out to some of those who were involved with the writing of this document. That was, besides the folks here on the panel, was Hannah Faye Albrecht, David McDougall, and Mary O'Hara Smith. And those folks that were also involved in the research part of this, Steve White, Alexis Schultz, Mary O'Hara Smith, David McDougall, Betty Jones, Eileen Shorey, Jamie Hart, and I'll take it from there. I was involved with the research part of this project, and when we first started, we were very interested to find out if any of the early pastors were involved in any way with slavery or personally owned enslaved persons themselves. Since our church was founded, as we said, in the early 1700s near a slave market, we assumed that we might find several who might have owned slaves prior to when the church moved to Greenwich Village. As we mentioned, the original First Church was located on Wall Street, just a few blocks from the slave market. So let's take a look at the timeline. Now here we see a period between when the British took control of New York all the way through the Civil War, showing when Old First was founded in 1717, and when it relocated to Greenwich Village in 1846. So when we look at this timeline of Old First history from the establishment of the church to the Civil War, out of a total of 12 pastors who served, public records indicate that at least 7 of those had owned enslaved people. Now, those 7 pastors are indicated on the timeline here in red, and they, let's see, I can just move the screen around for 1 second. There we go. They were confirmed by the public records, as we saw from the Northeast Slave Index. Once these records were located, we were at times able to cross-reference those records with our own church archives. For example, the Reverend David Boswick, who was pastor at Old First from 1756 to 1763, Reverend Boswick was pastor during one of the many periods of financial difficulty for the congregation. In trustee records from 1759, 2 years after leaving the church on Long Island, the Reverend Boswick is recorded in trustee records as stating, and I quote, "Since my removal to New York, I have paid 2 servants for better than 70 pounds, the whole of which, besides my yearly salary, is now expended." Most often, however, slave ownership was rarely mentioned in our church archives, but rather supplementary sources such as personal letters and published works. And that's the case with Reverend Samuel Miller. Samuel Miller was one of the most prolific preachers and writers of the early First Church, Old First Church. Reverend Miller was raised in a slave-owning family, but this was often mentioned only in relation to his early public statements, strongly opposing slavery. For example, in 1797, he addressed the New York Manumission Society. The address was a discourse promoting the manumission freeing of slaves and protecting such of them who have been or may have been liberated. It was a strong rebuke of slavery, and his address has been cited as one of the most passionate voices against slavery in the late 1700s. However, Reverend Miller did himself own enslaved persons at various points in his life. We found one public record from the 1810 census that indicates he owned one slave at that time, almost 15 years after his address. And we found records that after his tenure at Old First, at least one slave attempted to run away, and he purchased another from a slave trader who had deceived him. As such, Reverend Miller did not personally consider slaveholding a sin. And as he grew older, his stance became increasingly complicated. In 1823, Reverend Miller favored that freed slaves should be removed from the country because he believed, quote, if liberated and left among the whites, they would be a constant source of annoyance, of corruption, and a danger to the whites themselves. In other words, they must be severed from the white population and sent to some distant part of the world where they will no longer be in no danger either of suffering themselves or of inflicting it on others. About 10 years later, according to Reverend Miller's views on emancipation hardened due to a schism within the Presbyterian denomination itself. It was called the Old School, New School Schism, and it was the result of internal differences which had been simmering for many years. It came to a head in 1838. And church unity then became Reverend Miller's overriding concern. Briefly about that schism, the Old School, which I believe Old First was a part, was spread over both northern and southern states, and was deeply divided on the issue of abolition. Toward the end of his life, Reverend Miller denounced abolition and abolitionists, which is quite a turn from his early lectures and speeches, preaching. He felt that it was going to destroy the church's unity and peace, and he came to the conclusion that ministers like himself and the church should withhold judgment on the issue of slavery itself. And while he supported emancipation in some form, Reverend Miller concluded that the church could not afford further division. Whether this need for unity was an overriding concern or not, we found no evidence or references to slavery in any of our church archives from that period, or mentioned by the three Old First pastors who served during that Old School, New School schism. In fact, nowhere in our records during that period did we find any reference to slavery or even the Civil War itself. Even from the last of those pastors to serve at First Church, the Reverend William Ward Phillips, who was the only pastor to serve both on Wall Street and at the church's new home here in Greenwich Village. Incidentally, he died during his tenure in 1865, just 1 month before the end of the Civil War. So, using a combination of public records, church archives, and supplemental references, we've been able to learn a bit more about the history of this important part of First Church and the early pastors to get a better sense of our early founder. Suzanne?
So, you've heard of some of the smaller, some of the large details of what we were able to find, some of the smaller, more poignant moments as we learned about our pastors. I think that question, especially around Reverend Miller, of rupture and unity, and the question of preventing rupture versus building unity, were very important parts of why we're doing this research and what we hope to gain from it moving forward. we ended, I think, really centering the individuals who were most affected by slavery. We were able to identify through this deep dive into our records a number of Black, colored, Negro. There were very many terms that we saw used relating to these individuals in our records. And they were part of our worship community. They were admitted to communion. We don't know how they were welcomed in worship, if they were seated separately or together in the body of the congregation. But we do know that they were admitted to communion, they were baptized, they were laid to rest by our pastors. And we are one of the very important things I think we've been doing since the release of this report is annually recognizing and calling out the names of these 76 individuals who we uncovered as part of our communion of saints. But doing that, there is pain in doing this research, and I think I would just say, as we may pivot a bit now to you asking us questions about how we did this or deeper into this conversation, that it's important to take moments to gather yourselves and recognize what it is that we're really talking about. And with that, before I'm glad you, I think, now called out all of the members of our group, I do want to offer a moment of prayer before we move into the open conversation. So those of you who feel that you'd like to join in, please feel free. Otherwise, we won't mind us taking this. Loving God, you who gathers the outcast, heals the brokenhearted, and binds up their wounds, bring liberty and freedom to all whose lives have been entangled in slavery and continue to be harmed by its injustice in our world today. God of freedom and truth, we believe that your deepest desire, your most powerful energy, is that all creation might know about abundant life. We raise our voices in anguished prayer for our sisters and brothers, women and girls, men and boys, who have been wronged by slavery, exploited through human violence and greed. Lord, you demand justice for those who have been wronged. Give strength to those who illuminate and investigate. Encourage them when they are weary. Hasten the coming of the day when all people and our precious earth itself will be treated, not as a commodity, but as radiant images of your beauty, truth, and freedom. We pray this in the name of our Lord, now and forever. I would welcome any question from the audience or meetings also come along. I have a microphone for you, so we can be sure everyone.
Before the audience, I'd like to just ask a couple of questions. First, thank you for talking about the report. I do highly recommend everyone please go to the website, grab the brochure that does have the QR code. The report isn't terrifically long. Spend an afternoon reading through it. It's an incredible piece of research and an amazingly important piece of history. But one of the things, I just have a couple of those questions and then we'll hand it off to the audience. If you wouldn't mind putting it a little bit in a broader perspective of the national story in a way, because when we look at slavery, it's always, we look, by the time of the Civil War, I don't think it's only Southern, and it's always secular, like it's always industrial or household. How do you feel this kind of expands the perspective of looking at the history of slavery for our own city, but also for our own region and the country as a whole?
Yeah, I can address that. Our study was what's termed a microhistory. In other words, it's a history of our membership in terms of just our congregation. This is one congregation. So let me expand a little bit more on what slave ownership among the more wealthy members and among the pastors of our congregation was not that unusual in New York City. I actually spoke briefly to Jackie Lewis, who was the middle collegiate, and they were doing a similar project, and they found some of their pastors. And that's the Dutch Reformed Church, and it's actually even older than the Presbyterians here in New York City. To sort of zoom out a little bit, the issue of slavery in the United States has been an issue since the American Revolution. We have a pastor from New England, Samuel Hopkins, who wrote a petition to the Continental Congress urging them to immediately abolish slavery. And of course, they couldn't do that. And there are many New England representatives, or delegates to that Continental Congress who did want to do that, but they were from, mostly, as I say, from New England. The Southern contingent did not want to do that, so they had to compromise. And compromise on slavery was evident even in the drafting of the United States Constitution. We won't get into too much of that, but there was a 3/5 clause of slavery. There was, in fact, they didn't even use the word slavery in the Constitution. It was those in service. They didn't, and then there was later on, in the 19th century, there was this debate among abolitionists and pro-slavery people about what the Constitution actually said about slavery. Was it a pro-slavery document, or was it neutral, or was it anti-slavery? And that was actually a debate that's going on today among historians. In any case, slavery was seen as this as this real problem that was going to be developing. It was compromised on, as Lincoln said, it was he saw a nation have free and have slave, and that's what happened in the 19th century, because in the Northeast, in the 18th century, slavery was abolished. Vermont was the first state to abolish it. Shortly after the Revolutionary War, it was in their constitution, and one by one, the New England states and New York State was one of the last, 1827, and New Jersey was the very last to abolish slavery, although they didn't have as many. Slavery was very different in the South than it was in the North. The North, New York State in particular, had quite a number of slaves in the 18th century. Virginia had the most in that time. And the southern states did. They relied. The southern states it's like the historians like to say, was a society, was a slave society, whereas in the northern states were a society with slaves. Because they really depended on their economics in the South really depended on slave labor, whereas in the North there were different other supports for the economy. So slavery was not as crucial in the North to the sustenance of the economy. But as the North got rid of slavery and the South depended on more and more, and the slave population grew in the South, then the country became more divided. And it was this real problem. It began, well, it didn't begin, but one of the points was in 1820 was the Missouri Compromise, and that was over slavery. And it was Jefferson who said, when he had heard about the Missouri, the Missouri problem, it was a dispute about should the Western states were forming these slave states or free states. So the Missouri Compromise was supposed to address that. But Jefferson said he heard a fire bell in the night from that because he knew that the slave issue would not go away, and it was really going to be a problem unless it was resolved. And it's really the reason in the 18th century, when you had two anti-slavery organizations started. The very first one in the whole world was in Philadelphia, was the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And most of the members were Quakers. And then later on, was here in the New York Manumission Society. It was dedicated to abolishing slavery on a gradual basis in New York State, and they actually were successful in doing that. They also tried to get laws passed that would prohibit the transfer of slaves in and out of the state. So there was an internal slave trade as well. So all of those problems were happening. I wanted to just lastly talk about Reverend Samuel Miller, who was part of First Presbyterian. He was also very much a scholar, very well educated, and his speech in 1797 is sort of a milestone in terms of speeches for our pastors. He became more conservative during the 19th century. And it's not untypical of his generation because there's what's called the first wave abolition, which is in the post-Revolutionary War period. And then there was the second wave beginning around the year 1800. And this older generation, actually many became more conservative, and they also started to favor what was called the colonization movement. And it was the Colonization Society that began in 1816, and this was a voluntary, the idea was that free African Americans would voluntarily go to the country of Liberia, and many did, and many didn't survive, but they did establish the country of Liberia, but the colonization idea really failed. But people like Miller, who were gradualists, they wanted to see slavery end. They thought that African Americans could be educated and be integrated as part of the citizenry of the United States. He was initially not in favor of colonization, but he became that later on. So he's typical of that kind of generation, I would say. And they were also dismayed, I think, they were disillusioned by what abolition had become. It had become much more radical. At least by 1830, you had people like William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. You had some pretty radical anti-slavery people here in New York City. It's a whole other story. But anyway, it's kind of context I wanted to provide.
Sure. I just want to add a little context also with New York. I think one of the things that we found most of the reading doing this research is finding the incidents of slave owners and slave ownership and the connection to the slave trade. That New York had a central role. The slave market was right next to the cotton exchange on Wall Street, and a lot of financing of the slave trade, slave ships. Even after the abolition of slavery, a lot of slave ships came through New York and were outfitted and fueled by financial entities here in the cities. The city profited substantially by this slave trade, even after slavery had been abolished. I think one of the things that we tend to overlook in New York City history is that right before the Civil War, there was enough interest in the southern slave trade and the profits that came from the cotton industry that, one of the reasons was that the South always paid on time in cash, and that was a big value to a lot of the folks that were trading commodities in New York. I do want to say, however, that before the start of the Civil War, there was talk of New York City seceding from the Union because there was so many interests with Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was sort of the sister city of New York in terms of influence with the slave trade. Charleston brought the slaves in. Enslaved people were brought to Charleston, and New York had to pay for them. So there was a lot of connection between the New York financial community and the slave trade that continued even through the Civil War. Let's just mention one other quote, and this comes from the end of the report, and I think this is impression in terms of, when we think of large plantations and hundreds of slaves, and we think of New York, maybe 2 or 3 domestic slaves here.
Per
Taylor, yeah, per family. And there were a great number of them. Kira Singleton, who's the executive director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters Museum in Medford, Massachusetts, reminds us to think about the violence of forgetting and not seeing. Singleton says, the legacy of slavery is all around us. Slavery was an important part of Northern society as its economy. People look to the region as a whole and they say, well, there weren't that many enslaved people. But it's important to realize fewer numbers do not mean less suffering. Merely fewer individuals experiencing the same suffering in different ways, but in consideration.
Yeah, I agree with Sorrel. New York, even after 1827, when New York State abolished slavery, there was a huge economic connection to the South. I mean, there was cotton merchants in here in New York City who made tremendous fortunes in their connection to their business dealings with the South. Cotton was shipped here. About a third of the cotton produced by the South went to New England. It went to places like Lowell, Massachusetts, where they had textile mills. There was also 2/3 of it went to England, where they had textile mills. This was the age of the first industrial revolution, happening in the early 1800s. Continued, there's no question about it. And New York merchants really hated. There was an abolitionist, I would say, abolitionist community here, religiously based. They were evangelicals during the Second Great Awakening, and there were reformists. It was a small group, and the merchants really hated them because they were really threatening to upset this whole business arrangement that they had at the time. There were some merchants who pro-slavery, but there were some merchants who admitted that slavery was not a good thing, but they wanted it to be done on a gradual basis because of their business interests. Anyway.
Thank you, Noah. That was very, very helpful. So I want to open it up now to the audience to ask some questions.
Yeah, I do have a question, but I would just note that when you say slavery was ended in New York in 1827, there were still slaves who weren't emancipated at that time. You know, so that until the slaves died off, slavery wasn't ended in New York. But my question is, the research that you did, which is phenomenal, thank you so much for this. Did you look to statements from the Presbyterian Church and what they did or didn't say? And also, was there any record of interacting, for example, with the abolitionist churches like Beecher's, you know? I would be really interested in any insight into church politics as a whole.
Yeah, that's a good question. The denomination, if you're talking about the denomination, was really divided on the issue. There was a pastor who actually provoked. He was very much a known slave, and he was very radically anti-slavery. He was a Presbyterian pastor in Virginia, and he was ousted from his congregation because of his views in the South. The denomination took up at their general meeting, yearly meetings that they had, and they confirmed his ouster from this particular church And in the process, they kind of made the denomination at that time made a very divided, ambiguous kind of statement that that slavery was a bad thing, but at the same time, slaveholders were victims themselves in some fashion. They felt they were victims because it was a system that they inherited and that kind of thing. So it was really kind of wishy-washy kind of statement. And basically what they didn't want is politics. What they didn't want to do is divide their southern brethren, the southern churches from the northern churches, which actually eventually happened just at the advent of the Civil War. The Presbyterian Church divided. It wasn't until many decades later that it came back. What else? What other questions do you have?
Well, was there any record of like interaction with other church denominations where nowadays there are religious coalitions, for example, and there were records of differing denominations discussing social issues. If there were anything where a Presbyterian minister ended up talking to Henry Ward Beecher, that would be fascinating.
I could say that for sure. One of the interesting things within the Presbyterian Church and other denominations, I know that Reverend Miller, as an example, did have a conversation with the Church of Scotland, which is one of the mother churches of the Presbyterian Church, and was very, very passionate about those folks in England not advocating for abolition because it would split the unity of the church between this old school and new school. So it was there were certainly a lot of conversations both within the denomination and sort of extra-denominationally. We found that there were a lot of very ordered discourses and writings between them. Unfortunately, the project wound up being a little bit of a rabbit hole in that he found one thing, and then he just drove down and found all this interesting stuff. And it's also important to realize that our research was only on one of the three churches which became this Presby Church. We did the research on Old First. There's Madison Square Church and University Church, and we did not delve into their histories as well. Some of which was very fascinating. I wish I could expound more about the things that we found in those areas, but it's really interesting the amount of digging that we found more and more, and it really becomes a sort of lodestone that you really, really want to pursue. And as volunteers, we wish we could have done this full-time short. It's long.
I would just say, I think Soralan said it very well, but just to put maybe an underline on that, I think within our own archival records, I didn't see, and I don't think anybody reported that we found trustees or our session saying, we've talked to someone else and, we think X, Y, Z, or any public statements. So unfortunately, the answer for our particular church is, no, it doesn't look like it. I did find one, I know there was one trustee note where, that I happened to take into my notes tonight, in 1834, a decision was taken that they would do an annual collection on behalf of the American Colonization Society. I don't know whether that was ever actually put into effect because I don't remember then seeing it popping up in later minutes or financial records.
Yeah, just briefly, you didn't have the kind of interdenominational communication in those days that you have now, like the National Council of Churches, that's a very 20th century kind of thing. The Baptists and the Methodists and all these different other Protestant denominations, there might have been some communication, but not the kind of gatherings of in dialogue that you see in the 20th century.
And we did find, and I think it was a manumission society, there were people who were sent to a big meeting of it, may have actually been at our church, but that it was the only instance we found of it. It was.
Other questions?
First of all, I want to applaud you on doing the research and communicating your findings so well. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on next steps? What do you intend to do with your findings?
So, in terms of next steps, I would say that, as I sort of opened with, we really feel that having this is an important way to ground ourselves in terms of knowing who we are, what our history is, and perhaps with, and with what degree of understanding and humility we need to engage in future anti-racist work. That said, with that said, we have the Facing Racism Action Group, which is one of many social justice groups within the church, have focused our attention on, first we want to continue to raise up and find appropriate ways to recognize those Black individuals that we have within our history. We're also trying to cultivate stronger ties to some of the congregations within our presbytery that are continuing to experience the effects of the disadvantages that their communities have suffered through racialization that has redounded throughout our New York society. Beyond that, we have tried to think of this work and our need to move forward as something that we're not probably able to do individual restitution, but rather what are the community actions that we can take. And I think we're leaning towards works that help to support education and community development around some of the core issues we've always been involved with: homelessness, immigration, and strong faith communities. So those are sort of like, I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that.
Other questions?
In the antebellum period, can you say with any certainty with the Christian churches, what would be the practice of those who admitted Blacks as members? Where would they separately seat them? Say the balcony? Or what was the practice? Do you have any sense of what the practice was in those days?
Yeah, I can address some of that. Well, the white-led churches did have small numbers of African Americans, like First Church. I've done some studies on another Presbyterian church here in New York City called the Spring Street Presbyterian Church, and they had some members that were Black. Unfortunately, the churches who had them tended to segregate them into the balconies or in the back of the church. But the membership of African Americans in white churches was something that was prevalent up to the late 1700s. And then at that point, after about 1800, especially here in New York City, or New York State actually, when the gradual abolition law came into effect in 1799, it was really at this point that everyone could see that in New York State, slavery was finally put on a path of what we call extinction. There was really this big decline in the number of slaves, at the same time a big increase in the number of free African Americans. And this is the point where the Black Church started and Black benevolent organizations started. They really started to form their own communities. And so the membership of African Americans who were part of white-led churches started to decline when you get into the 1800s, and really populate their own churches. And I don't know if that answers you, but did you have any further questions about that? That's pretty much.
Yeah, so I would just reiterate from our own records, we were not able to determine what the seating arrangement was within this congregation. The church on Wall Street did have a balcony. When we first moved to this space, this church was the 1840s, so it wasn't as much of a question, but we didn't have balconies. But just overall, in terms of the seating in Presbyterian churches, I mentioned that one of the things we looked at were pew records, because in churches, Presbyterian churches at that time, that was essentially each family, as I guess some temples and synagogues do even today, the particular family paid for a particular pew, and only members of that family sat in that pew. The seats that were closest to the pulpit or most visible to the rest of the congregation had the most highest pew rents, and as you moved further back, pews were less expensive, and there were a few. We had one diagram of the initial pew chart here, and there were the pews that were sort of left open for general usage were at the back and on the sides.
I think we'll have time for one more question.
You listed the names of the 76 black members of the church over the years. Are there voices on record anywhere? Do you know anything about them? And second question, any way of knowing if their descendants might still be around?
There are not really their voices. There was one instance of an individual who his life was a little bit brought forward in the session minutes because he was brought in for a disciplinary discussion. Interesting fact was that that individual, we found, he was actually back again, he actually was expelled from the congregation, but he was welcomed back again so that his son could be baptized. So that was one instance where we found a little bit more about an individual. It is something that we weren't able to do with this project, but would love to do with the future research to try to maybe go to the Schomburg Center, see if we can get more detail about these individuals. Unfortunately, one of the things that is true as you look at the names is that many of them we have just a first name, or sometimes just a colored boy belonging to. So that would be very difficult to trace. But sorry. One other thing I wanted to say about that is, which relates to what David was saying, is that I did find in one of the member roster books, there was a page that had collected many of the colored members' names, and almost all of them had after their name, gone. How was it phrased exactly? But basically gone or expunged from the records for long absence, and that was in like 1834. So I don't know exactly at what point they left, but they were in the rosters in the 1700s, early 1700s, maybe in the early 1800s, and then by 1834, there seems to have been a moment where they culled their rolls and found that these individuals had all done.
Yeah, that's the time when I mentioned before that actually the black church was growing at that time. And so actually the black-white divide, it was more divided. You had black churches and white churches, and very few black members were black parishioners were members of white-led churches at that point.
All right, then a round of applause for